Ezra 5. Give you just a minute to turn there. Don't forget Sunday morning services, 9:30. Sunday school, 10:30 church. I know we're getting into vacation season. Some folks are already heading out and doing things, but let's try to be faithful. Try to invite others. Had a new fellow that came Sunday that Tanner had invited. He's met and talked to him, and he did show up on Sunday. He's probably in his 30s, and he needs to be in church somewhere. So good things are happening. All right, verse 6, chapter 5. The copy of the letter that Tatnai, governor on this side of the river, and Shethar-Boznai and his companions, the Aphersachites, don't correct my grammar here, which were on this side of the river, sent unto Darius the king. They sent a letter unto him, wherein was written thus, Unto Darius the king all peace. Be it known unto the king. Now remember, the background of this is these men came and they're asking, who give you the authority to build this? And so they told him, and now he's trying to authenticate their story, tell it to the king to make sure that these guys are saying what's right. If there's any record or anything of it. So be it known to the king that we went into the province of Judea to the house of the great God, which is builded with great stones, and timber is laid in the walls, and this work goeth fast on. So they're progressing and prospereth in their hands. Then asked we those elders, and said unto them thus, Who commanded you to build this house and to make up these walls? We asked their names also to certify thee, that we might write the names of the men that were the chief of them. And thus they returned us answers, saying, We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and build the house that was builded these many years ago, which a great king of Israel builded and set up. But after that our fathers had provoked the God of heaven unto wrath, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried the people away into Babylon. So in this letter, he's telling them basically what they told them, some history on the Jews. But in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Babylon, the same king Cyrus, made a decree to build this house of God. And the vessels also of gold and silver of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that was in Jerusalem and brought them into the temple of Babylon, those did Cyrus the king take out of the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered unto one whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he made governor, and said unto him, Take these vessels, go carry them into the temple that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be builded in his place. Then came the same Sheshbazzar, and laid the foundations of the house of God which is in Jerusalem, and since that time, even until now, hath it been in building, and yet it is not finished. Now therefore, if it seem good to the king, let there be a search made in the king's treasure house, which is there at Babylon, whether it be so that a decree was made of Cyrus the king to build this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send his pleasure to us concerning this matter. Lord, thank you for your word. Pray that you bless our time here together and help us to learn. In Jesus' name, amen. We're also going to get into chapter 6 tonight, but we know last time we saw the Jews had ceased in building the temple after the adversaries that had come against him. These adversaries first came with a proposal. We'd like to help you in this. And we serve the same God as you do and have offered sacrifices to this God as well. But we know they're listed as adversaries for a reason. And Zerubbabel refused their help, so the enemy went to plan B. And according to Ezra chapter 4, verse 4 and 5, they weakened the hands of the people of Judah and troubled them in building. They even hired people to go against them. The Bible calls it to frustrate, and that basically means to bring to an end in building this temple. And so the Jews were afraid. They're probably really discouraged because of this opposition. We know, according to chapter 4, verse 23, after the enemy writes a letter to King Artaxerxes and receives his answer back, the people made the Jews, we didn't get into that, but the people made the Jews cease building with force and power, according to chapter 4, verse 23. And the work was shut down for 16 long years, until the second year of the reign of a man named Darius, known as Darius the Great. And the adversaries may have thought they had won and defeated the plan of God, but God's plan and God's purposes are not going to be defeated. Everything's going to be just as he says it is. And God sent the prophets. We know it was Haggai and Zechariah, and probably most of you didn't know that the same Haggai and Zechariah that have books named after them are present here in this book as well. He sent them in chapter 5, and they conveyed to the people what God had told them to say, and we looked at that last week. Haggai, in Haggai 1, we read parallel basically to this. The message of Haggai was how that the people had been building their own houses, but God's house was still laid waste or remains desolate. And Haggai told them to consider their ways, how they're sowing a lot, but they're only reaping, they're only bringing in a little bit, and how they continued to eat and drink, but it wasn't enough, and how they continue to earn wages only to put it in bags that's got holes in it. So it's not like they were idle and just sat back and doing nothing. These folks are busy about things, but they're scared. And now other things are taking precedence over the work of God. And they weren't invested in doing what God had called them to do. And it appears that the blessings of God were not really on them like it could have been. I mean, they're working, they're doing things, but, you know, if you're working and putting it in bags with holes in it, stuff just going right through. It's like you don't have enough. And they needed to put God first and let God take care of the rest. And Haggai's message was to go up to the mountain, bring the wood, get back to building the temple of God. And God wanted them to know that he would take pleasure in it and he would be glorified by it. So that should be the single most important thing that you and I live for God's pleasure and for him to be glorified. But they all they had accomplished up to this point was just an altar and a foundation. The same people that we saw in the previous chapters singing, I believe it's chapter 3, singing, maybe chapter 2, I can't remember, but anyway, they're singing, shouting, playing music just because a foundation had been laid. Now they've stopped. They've stopped totally. And, you know, this goes for an example to us. What adversity, opposition, discouragement will do to us as well. I mean, it'll work on you. It'll do that to the church. Discouragement among the church you know what it usually does? It breeds more discouragement. You get a few people down and out, you're going to have a few more people down and out before it's over. Adversity can have a real effect on people today. But the message of Haggai and Zechariah from God worked. The Jews are confronted with their sins. They experience a fresh encounter with God, and they're shown what their real priority ought to be. The leaders, Zerubbabel, Jeshua, are renewed in their commitment to God. And they got back to building. We see in Haggai chapter 1, verse 4, the spirit of all the remnant came and did the work in the house of the Lord. So even though adversity and fear and discouragement can rage through a congregation like wildfire, the opposite's also true, I believe. You get people fired up for God, you get people wanting to work for God and interested in God, you know, that can catch on too and work through a church as well. So last week we ended with Tatnai, the Persian governor, others that had come with him. They came to the Jews in Ezra 5:3, and they wanted to know, who's commanded you to do this building? By what authority are you doing this building project? And even though the work had begun again, we know Satan and his tactics are never too far away to try to discourage or cause doubt or bring harm to what God's wanting to do. So no sooner had they renewed their commitment and confronted their sins and gone back to building, here comes another issue. Have you ever noticed personally, if you really try to start dedicating your life to God, get committed to God, start living for God, at least at the start of your commitment, there's always something that comes up that tries to derail you. That's where young Christians need to be very careful. If you just gotten saved, you know, you see people that get saved and then a little while they kind of drift away. There's always going to be something vying for your attention. Always something coming up. Y'all could probably, everybody here could probably found an excuse not to be here tonight. I mean, probably some of you are tired. If you ain't, you look like it. I'm just playing. But there's always something that will discourage you or keep you from being faithful to God in God's house and just for the things of God. And this man Tatnai was appointed the governor over Israel, and him and his men had to report to Darius, the king. And they don't want any sort of rebellion coming against Darius, so they're trying to do their job. Cyrus was long gone in his reign over Persia because he was the one that had given these Jews the authority to go back and even financed this building project. And God had worked in Cyrus's heart to do this, even though he was a pagan king. But what these men needed to know that have come here questioning, by what authority? Who gave you the authority to do this? Is the Jews aren't plotting a rebellion against the king. Matter of fact, they're still under Persian authority at this time. So even though they're on a mission from God, they're really not free from Persian rule. And Cyrus given this authority would date back all the way to 538 BC. We're now in the year 520 BC with a different king. Not only that, in between there's various kings that had taken the throne before Darius. But we closed last week seeing in verse 5, but the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, that they could not cause them to cease till the matter came to Darius, and then they returned answer by letter concerning this matter. So God was watching over them. The work did not cease. They didn't shut it down. And for us, you know, if we know, don't you think God's watching over us now? The eyes of the Lord are on us. we can't quit. We got to continue to persevere. You know, you can't get discouraged and down and out and all shook up and just over everything. You know, people will quit at the drop of a hat today. I mean, people just, it just seems like about anything they get discouraged at. But we need to continue in spite of all the enemy's tactics that come against us. We got to go on. Satan would love to destroy the work of the church. He would love for the church to be reduced to basically nothing, where nothing much is happening in the church. But we have a God that's watching over us to this day, and we need to commit to the work that he's called us to do in spite of the opposition, in spite of the discouragement that the devil may try to send against us. So Tatnai doesn't shut the work down, but he prepares a letter to be sent to King Darius to see if this work would be allowed to continue. So tonight, as we come to verse 6, we see the copy of the letter that was sent to King Darius in verse 7. They addressed King Darius respectfully with the words all peace or all prosperity is what that means. And back in those times, I guess you better show respect to the king, because your position would be in jeopardy if you didn't, and you might not live to eat supper, you know, because these times were much different than our times. Now, in this letter, we see it's much different than the letter that was written in chapter 4. It kind of distorted the truth, and it made the Jews look worse than really what they were. And going back to chapter 4, verse 13, the letter was sent to King Artaxerxes, and in this letter, they're claiming that if this city is rebuilt and the walls set up again, then these Jews are going to refuse to pay toll and tribute and custom. And basically, King, if this happens, it's going to hurt your revenue. So they're cautioning that this is going to lead to rebellion. They go on to say in chapter 4, verse 16, that if this city be built again and the walls go up, then King, you're not going to have any portion on this side of the river. So it was going to cut into the king's power. It was going to cut into his revenue. And Artaxerxes writes back in chapter 4, verse 19 and 20, that a search had been done, and it's been found that this city of old time has made insurrection against kings in the Jews or Israel's history. And that rebellion and sedition has been made by them. So Artaxerxes finds out some Jewish history himself. He says how there's been mighty kings over Jerusalem, kings that have ruled over countries beyond the river, and they've received toll and tribute and custom from these other countries. And we know that King Artaxerxes gave the commandment that these men cease in their work and this city not to be built until another commandment be given. And in chapter 4, verse 23 and 24, in the king's letter, we read that they went up in haste to Jerusalem to the Jews, and that's where they made the work to cease by force and by power. And so the work of the house of God ceased. And you think, why were these Jews fearful? Well, this is why. I mean, they were made by force and power. I mean, they're outnumbered here. So no wonder they're discouraged and fearful. These enemies are using force against them. But this letter that was sent to Artaxerxes was truly distorted. It made the Jews appear that if you let this go on, there's going to be a rebellion. It will end up costing you in the end, which wasn't in their plans. But Artaxerxes, he didn't want nothing of this, so he just shut it down. But now King Darius is ruling, and another letter is sent. this time to King Darius, but this time the letter is more accurate. The letter is true, as we see in verse 8. It doesn't seem as if Tatnai and those with him have an ulterior motive that we got to get this shut down. But what they want to know is, King, you okay with this? Because they got to answer to him. And they don't want to let nothing go up that would be against the king. So how they went to the province in Judea, to the great house of the great God, which was being built with great stones, and timbers being laid in the walls, and the work is going fast on. It's prospering in their hands. And he's writing this to the king, letting him know this is what's happening. After the Jews had had this fresh encounter with God and faced their sins, man, they're working. Progress is being made. We see no stop or no talk of stopping now, even though they're being questioned about their building project. Tatnai tells the king in verse 9 in his letter that we asked those elders who's commanded them to build this house, to make up the walls. And the walls are not done yet, but you would assume if you're building this, you're going to rebuild the walls too. In verse 10, he writes, we asked their names as well to make known to you who were the chief among them. So I would say in his letter, he's got Zerubbabel written down. He's probably got Jeshua written down. He's got their leaders. And in verse 11, he tells the king that the answer from the Jews, we ask them, who gave you this authority to do this? We're servants of the Most High God, of the God of heaven and earth. And their mission was to build the house that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and set up. Who was that? Anybody remember? Solomon. Now, a little history. Solomon's temple was completed in the 11th year of Solomon's reign in the year 960 BC. The second temple wouldn't be completed until the 6th year of Darius's reign, which is 516 BC. And we're now in the second year of the reign of Darius, when the rebuilding began again. So you know what? That's 440 years they went without a temple. 440 years since the last temple was completed. That's a long time ago. That's many moons ago. That's many kings ago. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. The Babylonians were defeated by the Persians. And somehow or another, this don't seem to add up. There's 70 years. But upon my research, this is what I found. 440 years, that don't seem right. So, you know, I could be off. But this is what I was trying to research and look up. But the Persians, but even if it's 70 years, that's still a long time. But the Persians now had a different king. Cyrus had given the order, rebuild. You can go back and rebuild. I'll even finance it. So a lot of history has happened over the years. But Zerubbabel and the Jewish leaders filled them in on some Jewish history. And they tell Tatnai, first of all, we're servants of the God of heaven and earth. You know what they're saying? Their God is the one true God. Our God is the authority over all of heaven and over all of earth. He is the master. He is the controller of the universe. And they informed Tatnai that to put in his, as he put in his letter to King Darius, verse 11, that their mission was to rebuild what was built many years ago. Now, I think those dates would be right because the temple stood for a long time. So it would have been, now it's been, over 70 years since it was destroyed, but while the temple stood, so it has been 440 years. I lost my mind there for a second. But that's okay. I'm 65 years old. I can lose my mind every now and then. So we are talking 440 years. In verse 12, they had also explained that their fathers had provoked the God of heaven unto wrath. So they're telling them some history. And because we did this, God gave us over to the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had taken them captive. He's the king of Babylon. And it was Nebuchadnezzar that destroyed the first temple that Solomon had built. And in verse 13, they also told Tatnai, which is included in this letter to King Darius, that it was Cyrus, the king of Babylon, Persia, Babylon. And after he defeated the Babylonians, this same Cyrus, they tell him this, he's the one that gave us this authority. Well, these guys, they probably don't know nothing about this. They don't know what's going on. And in verse 14, they even explain how the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar took and he put in his temple in Babylon, he gave them back to the Jews so they could replace them, put them back in their rightful place in the temple that they were going to build there in Jerusalem. Now, who is this Sheshbazzar that's mentioned here? Sheshbazzar. Who do you think he might be? Now, some think this could be a co-leader with Zerubbabel. My thought is, and this is my opinion, and you can take that and a nickel, and you still just got a nickel. I think this could be another name for Zerubbabel because he says he's governor. Well, who was the governor that we've been reading about? It was Zerubbabel over the Jews. So, and in verse 15, King Cyrus told Zerubbabel to take the vessels, or Sheshbazzar, which put them in the house of God, take those. Verse 16, Sheshbazzar, same person that we believe is Zerubbabel. Remember, there was Daniel, and he was also called, what, Belshazzar? Okay? So I personally believe this is the same guy we're reading about as Zerubbabel. He talks about how Sheshbazzar came, laid the foundation of the house of God. Since that time it's been in building, but it's not been finished yet. Well, there's been a 16-year delay too. It's not been in the building phase for a while. So Tatnai's letter was accurate. It didn't seem like he had another motive. He just wants the king to be informed of what's going on. He's not like those in chapter 4. Saying, you do this, you let them build this, it's going to hurt you in the end. He's just stating the facts. So in verse 17, he asks, if it seems good to the king, I'd like for you to make a search in the king's treasure house, which is in Babylon, to verify, to see if the things that these Jews are saying are so. Because if it is so, there's probably going to be some kind of archive record or something from a king that said he did this because he made a decree. Tatnai wants to find out if there really was a decree by Cyrus the king. And he states in his letter to let the king send his pleasure. In other words, we're waiting on an answer from you, king. You find out about this, you let us know, and in chapter 6, we see what happens when this letter reaches King Darius. Verse 1, King Darius Even he don't automatically know what's going on. He didn't say, I remember that. Yeah, let him go ahead and... He don't know the answer to what Tatnai is asking. Years have passed since Cyrus's decree, and so Darius makes his own decree or command that a search be made in the house of the rolls where the treasures were laid up in Babylon. Now you'd think in this amount of time, and the Jews being there and returning, that these leaders would, oh yeah, I remember that. Evidently he don't know. And he knows that if this decree were true, there should be a record of it. So what they're going to have to do is research history to see if it's so. And in verse 2, after searching the government records, they found in the palace in the province of the Medes a roll that told them all they needed to know. And in verses 3 and 4 contained in this roll, it explains, just like the Jews told Tatnai, which he included in his letter to the king, that in the first year of Cyrus's reign, he had indeed made a decree that the house of God be built. He even gave the measurements of it. The roll said it was to be constructed of 3 rows of great stones and a row of new timber, and the expenses of paying for this temple was to be paid out of the king's treasury. We see in this chapter 6. So in verse 5, the records provided proof how the golden and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar took were restored again, brought back to be put back in the temple. And after finding the proof, in verse 6, King Darius instructs Tatnai and those working with him. They ain't got a cell phone, so yeah, just go ahead and do it. They got to send a letter back. So they send a letter back, and after finding out the proof of this, he basically says, stay away from the work. Let it be. In verse 7, they were to leave these Jews alone. They were not to hinder them. They were not to discourage them. But they were to leave them alone to build the house of God in its place. And in verse 8, King Darius also makes a decree what they should do for the elders of the Jews for their building project of the house of God, and the supplies for the building. It were going to come from the king's goods. Tribute money from beyond the river. They were to give them the expenses to build the house of God, and they were not to be hindered. Ain't God good? When people get their hearts right with God, when people have a heart to do something for God, yeah, it'd been a long layoff. It'd have been another king, and maybe they could have just said, looks like we can't do nothing now. Cyrus is gone. He's the one that said it. He's the one that financed it. Cyrus is gone. God revives the work, and by another king, he says, yeah, that's what Cyrus said, and we're going to honor that, and we're going to pay for it. God always makes a way. Even worked it out that his temple's going to be paid for by Gentile money. Ain't that something? This building project looked like it was dead in the water 16 years ago. But with a fresh view of God, with the people getting right with God, repenting of their sins after the message of Haggai and Zechariah, it's going strong again. And it's even being paid for again by a man that's believed to be a pagan king. The Bible doesn't explicitly indicate to us who King Darius worshiped. Historically speaking, he's known as Darius I. And he was said to worship Ahura Mazda. Ooh, anybody drive a Mazda? This was the chief deity of Zoroastrianism. You say, what is that? I have no idea. But this is said to be seen in his own inscriptions in history. Now, I don't know if you knew this or not. Guess who's still alive when the Jews leave Babylon to go rebuild the temple? A man by the name of Daniel. Who'd have ever thunk Daniel's tied into all of this too? I mean, the last mention of Daniel is said to be in the 3rd year of Cyrus, in Daniel chapter 10, verse 1. So the 3rd year is the 1st year of Cyrus the king. He made a decree. So they've left. I doubt Daniel lived to see it through. He's an elderly man. He's still in Persia / Babylon when they go back for this rebuilding project. So the return to Jerusalem began in 538 BC. Daniel was taken captive at 605 BC, somewhere around in there. So if he was in his teens in the time that he was carried away from Babylon, you'd have to think he's probably in his 80s or so now. Remember in Daniel chapter 6, there's a Darius mentioned there. Now, I got to looking at this and trying to decipher this. But he's listed as Darius the Mede. This is a different Darius from what I can study on than Darius the Great. And Darius the Mede showed great personal distress over Daniel's fate of being cast into the lion's den. Now, if it was Darius, this Darius, then that would mean Daniel's really, really old. I don't think this can't be the same one. Darius the Mede and Darius I, Darius the Great, it's not the same people. But Darius the Mede expressed apparent hope that Daniel's God could save him being cast into the lion's den. So at least he had some respect and acknowledgement of Daniel's God. And after Daniel survived, it was Darius the Mede who declared to the people that they should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, and was praising the God of Israel as the living God. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean he was converted. It might have been a political proclamation, but some think Darius the Mede was the same as Cyrus the Great. I don't know. Possibly could be just a different title. It's also suggested he could have been a governor appointed over Babylon by Cyrus. But one thing we can conclude from all of this, Darius the Mede, whoever he was, whether it was Cyrus or whether he was governor or whatever, he had witnessed the power of God at some point by Daniel being saved from the lion's den. And people could say, well, them lions, they wasn't really vicious. Well, why'd they kill the other fellas that they throwed in there? And you know what this shows us? This world and all the wicked people and all the different beliefs, they need to see God at work in us. Our message has got to be believable. And Daniel's message and trust in God was certainly believable. God had worked in Daniel's life. But it's doubtful that Daniel lived for the completion of the temple, but he was at least alive. And so, you know, Daniel, he wasn't bashful. You know, they tried to catch him because he's praying, and they tried to make a decree to do away with him. You know, anybody that prays any other God but you, it didn't faze him a bit. He went right on living for God. And you know what? He went right on praying. And what this world does and what this world says, it shouldn't faze us a bit. You keep right on living for the Lord no matter what. So Daniel was a good witness in a terrible world for his God, in a pagan world. And back to our scripture, verse 9. I thought I'd just give you a little history there. King Darius the Great continues in his address of this letter and says, whatever these folks need, if it's young bullocks, rams, lambs for their burnt offerings to the God of heaven, whether it be wheat, salt, wine, oil, according to what the priests needed in Jerusalem, he said, let them be given that day after day without fail. They're paying for their sacrifices. Pagan people paying for sacrifices to God. In verse 10, Darius says that they may offer sacrifices of sweet savors unto the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. This king wants these Jews to pray for him and to pray for his sons. That's the kind of effect that we ought to have on people. Where they're in a jam, where they're going through things, they might not go to church, they might not even believe in Jesus, but they've got faith that you'll pray for me. You could be a great witness to them. And then in verse 11, Darius makes another decree that whosoever alters these words that he stated, let timber be pulled down from his house, set up the timber for him to be hung on it. Wow. Basically, don't mess with my decree. It's going to cost you. Some believe this to be hung on was to be beaten or whipped at the post. That was the manner of the Persians and other nations. But however we take it, it's going to be bad news for anybody that went against what the king decreed. And that person's house was to be made a dunghill. In other words, you don't build it back. Never to be rebuilt. And Darius goes even further with this in verse 12, where he said in chapter 6, he said, and the God that has caused his name to dwell there destroy all kings and people that try to put their hand to alter and destroy this house of God, which is at Jerusalem. As old country people say, sounds like he's for it. I mean, he wants it to be done. And he ends his letter with, I, Darius, have made a decree. Let it be done with speed. Don't waste no time making this happen. So in verse 13, when Tatnai and the others got the king's letter, they put it in place speedily. And in verse 14, the Jews built, they prospered through the prophesyings of Haggai and Zechariah, who'd sent them the words of God to get back to work. These folks did what God told them to do. And we see in chapter 6, verse 14, they finished the temple. Verse 15 tells us the temple was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. So once they got back to work, it took them about 4 years to get it done. After a 16-year hiatus. And it was finished in the year 516 BC. We know the enemy tried to stop the work. They're unsuccessful. The people became afraid and discouraged for a while, long time, 16 years. But when they did what the prophets told them to do by the commandment of God, it didn't take that long, comparative, to get God's work done. And you know what? We could say it could take us years to do that. It could take us, you can't build a ministry, people not interested in all of this. You'd be surprised what God can do with willing people. Even the Bible says, for there first be a willing mind. It's accepted according to what a man hath and not what he hath not. Amazing things can happen when God's people come together to accomplish the will of God. and amazing things can still happen today, I believe, when God's people unite together for his work. You know, you hear all the people today say that things like, and you know, I'm probably guilty of it myself. Nobody's interested in the things of God. You know, it's easy just to say that. Well, there's got to be somebody interested. I mean, we've got people here. We've got all kinds of people up there. We've got people over here. And to just throw a blanket out there and say nobody's interested much today. Nobody's devoted today like they used to be to commit to God. And it's almost like we're just okay with saying negative things. We're not expecting much to happen. You know, we just kind of status quo. We'll just keep on chugging along. We don't really expect much to happen. But what if Christians got their priorities in line and quit focusing on all the negative and listening to all the naysayers and get our own selves right with God, get our own selves on fire for God? Don't you think God could still work a work even in today's time? Yeah, we can focus on people this, people that, people, you know, they're interested in sports and they're doing this and they're doing, you know, I can't help what other people are doing. You know what I can help? What I do. I can't make people have a relationship with God, but you know what I can do? I can better my relationship with God. And so we're worried about what everybody else done, but I think if Christians together would unite, get their own selves on fire for God and right with God, you might see some things happen that you didn't expect. We ought to be brave enough and committed enough to find out what God can do through us if we'll do what he says. Any questions tonight?
Yeah, not the Vador. What is that convert her about now?
What's that now?
We're finished in the month of Vador. What is that convert her about now?
I don't know. Look that up right quick. I'm just telling you, I don't know. So I ain't going to make up no answer. See, anybody got their phone?
What's the
Adar. What is Adar in the Hebrew calendar?
It says February to March.
February to March. Well, you stumped me, but you didn't stump Google.
Obviously, the influence of Daniel within the Babylonian and then even the Persian court influenced the kings that were in Babylon and Persia to allow them to understand and see the works of God and to therefore know that this is something we need to support because we certainly don't want to turn and anger that God against us. Obviously, we felt that way to ask for them to pray for him and his son, to ask for his family.
Yeah.
So obviously, they knew Daniel, knew the reputation of Daniel, knew the Daniel's and the reputation of Daniel's God.
Yes.
They may have had their own idols and everything else that they worshiped, but they knew Daniel, and that influence of Daniel, I think, played a big part in this whole bit about being able to rebuild the temple. And you as far as the aging of it, you remember back in the verse of chapter 3, it said that some of the elders remembered the old temple. So when they laid the foundation stone, they cried.
Yeah.
It was a great celebration, but they also cried.
Yeah.
So that time frame is within one lifespan of occurring. So it wasn't the 400 years or anything else. If anything, the main temple stood for almost 400 and some odd years because it's what, about 980 or something when it was, the original one was built. And then it
I
was
forgot the date.
about 580 something or 86 when Babylonian conquered Jerusalem. So it's
But
probably about 400 years.
I know it was 440 years from when they got back to work to for rebuilding the other temple since the completion of the first temple. Not the destruction, but the completion of Solomon's temple. Good points.
Well, we're in Kenny's class, so we get to see Daniel, and then we're reading Ezra and stuff here. So we're getting the same correlating histories, and they overlap each other, which is good. You know,
It kind of puts the Bible together.
correct. Correct.
Anybody else got a question? Good point. Thank you for being here. Even with, we got some missing because of store night up here, we still got a good crowd here. And I thank you. I hope you'll be here for Sunday. Do your best to invite somebody. You never know, they might come. They might come. But I'm sure they won't if you don't invite them. So try that. I love you. You're at liberty. Chair party has started up at the building.